mission is to prepare people to be leaders of gospel-inspired transformative change in pursuit of a more just and compassionate world. We are delighted to welcome today the stated clerk of the PCUSA, Reverend Ji-Yoon Oh, and to our campus for the first time, she tells me. So happy to have you here. Reverend Carson Rhine, the former executive presbyter of the Presbytery of the James and presently pastor of Summit Presbyterian Church in Stafford, Virginia, will introduce our stated clerk in a moment, but I first want to offer just a brief word of gratitude to Reverend Rhine for actually making this visit possible, as well as the reception afterwards, to which everyone is invited. And he did that through the Rhine Fund here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. So we are very grateful, Carson, to you for your friendship and faithfulness to this school. And I invite you to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce the Executive Director and stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA, if I can say all those words, Reverend Ji-Yoon Oh, who was elected last summer at the General Assembly and installed then. She's the first Korean American to serve in this position in our denomination. It's amazing all the degrees she has. Undergraduate degrees in biology and German studies from MIT, Master of Science in Finance from Florida International University, and Master of Divinity degree from Columbia Theological Seminary. She had no idea when she was doing that degree in finance that she'd be in the position she's in now, but it sure has paid off well. For 5 years, she served as director of the Mid-Council Ministries in the Office of the General Assembly and was previously the OGA manager of call process support. Ordained as a teaching elder by the Presbytery of Tropical Florida on behalf of the Presbytery of Chicago, she served in several pastoral roles as well as hospital chaplain. And we're particularly privileged today to have her here on the 9th day of her marriage. She was married on March 22nd and was willing to give us time to be with us 9 days into it. Please come, welcome the stated clerk.
Thank you all. It is good to be with you today. As you heard, my name is Ji-Yoon Oh. I have been in my position as stated clerk of the General Assembly of the PCUSA since August 1st, and then as executive director of the Interim Unified Agency since the middle of October. So it has been a bit of a steep learning curve and a lot of drinking out of the fire hose type of thing that has been part of this journey, but also a real joy to be here and to be able to connect with folks throughout the denomination and at various places where we are all trying to be good disciples to Christ Jesus in the world at this particular moment in time. What I hope to do today is to talk a little bit about what I think some of the opportunities for the church are, some of the things that I think are sort of foundational to who we are as PCUSA, talk a little bit about the unification between the former office of the General Assembly and the former Presbyterian Mission Agency to form the Interim Unified Agency, and then leave time open for questions and answers. So let me just start by saying that really I think this is a unique time in the life of the world where the church can, I think, really find its voice again to speak into a world that needs to hear the good news of Jesus Christ in a particular way. And it's the voice that is Reformed, it's Presbyterian, and it's also uniquely PCUSA. And I think that voice is really different from an NGO voice or another ecumenical voice or just a faith voice. It's a particular voice. And what I mean by that is that really on the next slide, I'll sort of go through quickly on some of this. And you all know this, right? I mean, in the Reformed tradition, we believe particular things about God's sovereignty and God's call for us to be active disciples in the world. And so we will continue to pray and act to make God's love and justice visible and real in the world. And that means real action and also words, but also action that actually backs up those words and those beliefs, that it's really a both and. that is needed in this time. That will reaffirm our call to witness to the God whom we know in Jesus Christ, right? That's a very reformed statement. We will also continue to be followers of Jesus Christ and be transformed into the cruciform shape of his life, death, and resurrection. That means transformation both for us as well as the world, that it's not just about transforming the world, but it's also about transformation for ourselves as disciples. And that will also reaffirm our call, I think, in particular in this time, not to seek political power for ourselves and for our own good, but to act in the world towards what God's vision of wholeness and peace is. Especially when the world is seeking power for its own good, power for its own enrichment, power for the sake of power and control. I think we have a unique witness to be able to say we think about power and authority differently because of who we are. And so, sort of right quickly following on that, right? God is sovereign and God alone. I think this is one of the fundamental things, and also about God being the Lord of the conscience, has been a foundational piece to us being able to sign on as plaintiffs in the religious freedom lawsuit around the sensitive locations rescission memo from the Department of Homeland Security. And that's an important piece. The first hearing is this week, and we were able to actually sign on to that because we have a policy statement that says God alone is Lord of the conscience, and God alone is sovereign, God alone, not rulers or anything else. And that we also acknowledge that we ourselves as humans are saints and still sinners at the same time. We also say that Christ is head of the church. And that this is really then what we're trying to do is actually be church together with Christ as its head, and not actually own the church for our own selves or perpetuate it for the sake of perpetuating the church itself, but to really be the body of Christ and the church of Christ in the world. We're also called to be a covenant community as a church. And so that for us, I think that means that we belong together in a particular sort of relationship where we can then be in relationship in spite of disagreements, relationships in spite of some of the things that create conflict and tension among us. And that we promise that we will work out our differences. We promise that we will work out ways to be restored to one another, to be conversation partners, to be curious about things that happen instead of taking our balls and going home. That when things get rough, we will continue to stick by one another. And I think that sort of sense of stickiness in community and that sense of belonging that we can create in a world that is also, I think, filled with people who are lonely and isolated and seeking that sense of belonging is a really important thing, a witness that the church can give at this time. We also believe that the marks of the church are right preaching, right administration of the sacraments, and right discipline, all of those things that are part of our Reformed witness in the world. And preaching that isn't just about the pulpit, right? That preaching happens in a lot of different ways, in deed and in word, from the pulpit, when we're out in the public square, when we're in conversation with other human beings, in relationship. And that the sacraments, not just the actual ritual part of it, but then the living out of the sacraments in our discipleship life is also really important. And being able to tend to those things and being able to hold one another accountable to how we preach the word in word and deed, how we live out those sacraments in word and deed, and then how we actually attend to the discipline, being accountable to one another, accountable to ourselves, accountable to God, as God calls us to faithfulness in the world. All of those things that actually, again, tend toward the wholeness of the body as well, I think is important. And we also believe that the church calls, builds up, and sends out. that I think any time that we're actually missing one of these pieces, we're in some ways not doing all that the church has been called to do. That when we only build up the body but don't actually send out in action into the world to engage and be neighbors in the world, that we are in essence only doing part of the work of the church. When we don't call people in to the church, we're also missing a key component. And so evangelism, right, is important. Building up the body is important. Sending out is important. We also believe that all believers are called to the vocation of discipleship, the priesthood of all the baptized. And that some folks who actually were with me at lunch heard me say this, that the pastor as CEO model has not really done a lot of favors for us in the church, where we have professional Christians who are supposed to carry out the work of the church while others just make decisions, has not necessarily done any favors in terms of our life of discipleship, in terms of our church vitality. That what we really do believe is that all folks are called to the vocation of discipleship, and that means that all of us can then be called to leadership. So within the denomination, as a Presbyterian tradition, we believe that we discern God's will best in community that's fully participating and fully represented. And so part of that work then means in this time working toward full inclusion and participation for all the communities that are part of the PCUSA. We have the phrase, listening to voices long silenced, as part of our brief statement of faith, as part of our life together. We want to make sure that our processes support that listening to those voices, that our processes support the access for folks who have been denied access in the past or who have had trouble accessing our spaces in the past. At the same time, and so part of then how we actually are together in Presbyterian polity is that ordered ministries are about function and not status. I think this is really hard sometimes because I think there is something about that ordination that does confer a certain sort of recognition in the world that makes it easier sometimes for us to be in the world and to accomplish certain things. And yet for us, we really do believe in a functional ordination. And I think part of the corollary then to this means that anybody can really be a leader in the church with or without ordination. And so folks can participate on committees, actually, without ordination. Folks can be leaders, spiritual leaders within the church without ordination. And at the same time, folks are called to ordered ministries for a particular purpose. And because we believe then this sense of communal leadership and communal decision-making and communal discernment, we also believe that ministry in all expressions of the church should be shared, especially discernment and decision-making. So I think sometimes when we say to people, what does it mean to be Presbyterian? People are like, oh, we love committees. I hope, right, we remember that we don't love committees just because we love committees. Right? The committees are toward the end of communal discernment and decision-making because we believe that when we are community together, bringing all of our different lenses that we bring in our diversity, that's when we can discern God's will more fully and more completely. That's when we can check our biases. That can be the ways in which we check our human sinfulness to not be able to, all the time, check our uses of power for our own gain. That when we are in community, even though it can slow us down, we hear God's voice more clearly. And so that's why we love committees, not just because we love sitting in meetings for endless hours, although some of us do like sitting in endless meetings, endless hours of meetings. And also that really, right, so sort of the, what does it mean to be Presbyterian? And people say, oh, we're decent and in order. Well, the decent and in order is also not an end in and of itself. We are decent and in order so that we may hear the voices that have been marginalized, the voices of the minorities, so that we may hear God's voice that may actually be coming to us in those sort of still and small voices. So that we're not actually trying to discern through chaos, but discern through a way of listening to one another and attending to the voice of God. And so, again, we believe that discernment is best done by a group, not an individual, and that elected councils discern the will of God and make decisions. So when folks are elected in councils to do that work of discernment, we hope that we're also praying for those leaders. We also hope that we are choosing and calling the diversity of the leadership that is present in the body, again, so that those who are sitting at table can bring the diversity of lenses in order to be able to fully discern God's will. And as part of that, then, we believe that God created diversity and calls us to unity as a church in that diversity. Now, we're an 87% white denomination. We're continuing to think about what it means for us to continue to live into the legacy of our past, both the positive legacies, the negative legacies, and the things in between. And thinking through what it means for us to continue to welcome the voices of diaspora communities that are among us, those communities that have been marginalized and harmed by the church, those whose voices have been speaking up, but maybe we have not attended to in the way that we needed to in the past. And all of that means we really do need to think about how all can participate and how all should be able to participate. And so just thinking about two instances in that previous slide, one of the pieces that's really important is representation. And we talk about representation, and I hope that if you haven't seen the statement by the GA Committee on Representation, you might go back and read a statement that they put out when the executive order about the DEI programs came out. And they do this beautiful job of really leaning into our foundational values of representation and full participation to say, this is why we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, not because it's a fad right now, but because we have long believed that God has created diversity and calls us to open up spaces for the full inclusion and the full diversity of who is part of God's body. And so these representation functions where we attend to who is in the room and who is at the table when decision-making is happening and discernment is happening is really important for us to attend to. And that can happen both as a representation piece that is thinking about the demographic data of who is in the room or who is at the table. It can also happen in terms of thinking about process observation and accountability functions. And not just accountability as, again, sort of slapping on the wrist for bad behavior, but actually calling us into better behavior, back into our aspirations. And this other piece that committees versus commissions, sure that you know this from polity classes, that commissions require us to be ordained as teaching elders or ruling elders, but committees, there is no requirement for ordination to participate. Folks can be members of churches or participants in churches and still be part of committee. And so we can think more expansively about how we actually create our decision-making and discernment bodies that open up a space of more communal engagement and decision-making when the world is trying to shrink those decision-making tables, when the world is saying that those voices don't matter. We have an opportunity to expand our tables and expand our thinking about who can be involved in discernment and decision-making. And all should be able to participate. That's the other part. All can participate and all should be able to participate. That, again, brings into question two pieces for us. accessibility, how do we make it possible for folks to get to the table or to the room? But also inclusion. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, sometimes we actually talk about it interchangeably, or sometimes we separate it in our denomination out to diversity that is really talking about race and ethnicity, and inclusion that is often talking about LGBTQIA inclusion. But we're talking about it in terms of some of the work of intercultural competence. Diversity is about the demographics, who is there. And inclusion, they say, is really about the experience of those who are at the table, so that folks not only are at the table, but their voices actually matter in the discussions. And so instead of just doing the number counting, we commit to saying that those voices actually need to be listened to and tended to. And we have to ensure that access is given so that those voices can be heard. And we do this at a few different sort of expressions. The General Assembly, this is actually sort of a common thing that happens, I think, and this also happens with my title sometimes too. And when people are talking about the denomination or what happens generally and who makes decisions, there's a lot of things that work around that get brought together to mean interchangeable things, but they're not really, right? So the General Assembly is the group of folks who are commissioners who are elected and gathered every 2 years. And technically, they are commissioners for the whole 2-year term until that next group of commissioners is actually becomes commissioned at the assembly meeting. So the General Assembly is not the agencies, it's not the entities of the denomination. It's really those group of people who are elected from among the presbyteries to be that body that is discerning and deciding on behalf of the denomination what God's will is for us in that time. And I think that that piece is really important, especially in this time. I want to go back to the lawsuit. That our polity actually says that the stated clerk of the General Assembly, neither the stated clerk or the General Assembly or anybody else actually has the power to speak for the entire denomination. I, as the stated clerk of the General Assembly, can only speak on behalf of the General Assembly insofar as they have spoken in policies and statements that they have approved at assembly gatherings. And so if you were to look at the filing for the lawsuit on religious liberty, all the other denominations and other religious bodies actually have filed on behalf of a board of trustees, or they have filed on behalf of the denomination itself, or that whole body. And in our line, it actually says, GNO, stated clerk of the General Assembly on behalf of the GNO, stated clerk on behalf of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. Because that's the only group of people that I am actually authorized to speak on behalf of, not the entire denomination, but the General Assembly, insofar as they've actually made that decision together. But when we do talk about the denomination, right, there are some things that we can, it is really the sort of broader Presbyterian Church USA, and there are things that we can do as individual congregations, as individual leaders, but there are also things that we can not do as individual congregations or people in terms of impact. Not that we couldn't do it separately, but that we can't actually have the sort of impact that we want when we do it individually. And so we come together as a connectional church, as a covenant community of faith, in that particular expression of the body of Christ, the PCUSA, to be able to do those things together. And we are governed by councils. And each of the councils has a particular responsibility to ensure that the church, as the PCUSA, regardless of what expression, local or sort of national expression it is in, is living out our values and our commitments in relation to God and to one another and to the world. And so a lot of our presbyteries, I think a lot of our congregations, a lot of our synods are asking right now as we are in the General Assembly expression, including the Interim Unified Agency, what is the thing that we are being called to do at this particular time, in this particular expression, as different councils within the body of Christ? Is it the job of a General Assembly agency to do the ministry on behalf of everybody in the denomination? Or is it to equip and empower and support and journey alongside? Or is it to give grants? Or is it to do something else, right? Or some combination thereof? What is the value of a council to those who are part of that council? And we'll continue, I think, to have to ask that question as we think about discipleship more broadly. And then there is the work of the state clerk, and for my own job, this is actually what's partly on the website that actually shows what my job is supposed to be, and then also a little bit, it's sort of a huge sort of summary of what I'm supposed to do in this new role. I am the first person in this combined role that the Unification Commission combined in October of last year to say this is the first step in unification between the former Office of the General Assembly and the former Presbyterian Mission Agency. And it was to combine the ecclesial functions of the church and the executive leadership of the mission arm of the church into one position. And so in that role, my job is to be the chief ecclesial officer carrying out the ecumenical work and constitutional functions of the General Assembly in the documents that are listed up there, to interpret assembly actions alongside the co-moderators of the current assembly, but to also do the interpretation for previous assembly actions, to represent the church at denominational and ecumenical councils, to provide vision, interpretation, and inspiration for the denomination, and to provide executive leadership for the Interim Unified Agency. And I realize these are not really inspired slides, that I should have more images and less words on there. I'm gonna keep working on that. But I do think, again, part of the sort of value, I think, of our voice comes when we keep drilling down from our Reformed witness to our Presbyterian witness to a particular PCUSA witness, which I think exists then as part of our social witness policies of the General Assembly. And some of those, right, so in huge broad strokes, is to stand and advocate with and for those who need that accompaniment, that empowerment, that standing alongside, allyship, and advocacy. And some of those groups that seem particularly at risk right now are those whose health and well-being are threatened because either their access is being denied to health care or the availability does not exist because of particular communities that they live in, as well as health insurance issues that continue to be a large part of our conversation nationally. We also commit to, as part of our General Assembly policies, standing with and for our LGBTQIA+ siblings and communities. And especially today on Transgender Day of Visibility, this is particularly important as the T and the word transgender are being erased from a lot of websites and a lot of places within our society and the government pages and things like that, that there's a particular voice that the church can give by seeing and acknowledging and lifting up and saying the word transgender at this time. Standing with and for and advocating with and for our immigrants and refugees. And so part of that lawsuit will continue to, as we participate with our partners, will be part of that work. But I know that really the local enforcement action and the local standing with and for will be so important in the coming days. And so we'll continue to have ways of engaging both together nationally, but also as call to action that continues to go out for different things that folks can do in your local communities. Also, continuing policy, especially over the last several General Assemblies, is this commitment to deepening our care for creation and advocating for the care of all of creation, and that climate justice will continue to be important in this time. The Presbyterian Disaster Assistance folks talk about the huge rise in multi-billion-dollar catastrophes that we've seen. That it used to be once every few years where we saw that, and now there are several in 1 year. And you all have seen that play out in perhaps your communities or the communities where you have loved ones, but it's also on the news. So we continue to work towards, not just nationally, but internationally, working with fellow partners in humanitarian aid and relief, showing up as the church, not just in the immediate aftermath, but actually continuing to journey in the recovery process until the community can be made whole again. We'll continue to work towards structural racial equity and systemic economic justice, continuing to build on the Matthew 25 commitments that many presbyteries and congregations have made. And we'll continue to work towards wholeness within our communities, with our domestic and global partners. And that includes the work of reconciliation, of reparative justice and action, repairing relationships, and continuing to work on holding and creating and advocating for spaces of safety for those who are experiencing violence and war and conflict of all sorts. And continuing to work towards healing and wholeness and those who are struggling with well-being. It's also important that we continue to support vocation of leaders, of all sorts of leaders within the church, and just continuing conversations are happening about, even in a denomination that believes in functional ordination, what does leadership look like? What is the meaning of ordination? And some of you may be aware that there is a task force on ordination that will be giving its report at the next assembly in 26 in Milwaukee. Continuing conversations about how we train commission ruling elders and how they step into various leadership roles, not just as another alternate pathway to teaching elder leadership, but as spiritual leaders unto themselves, doing important ministry in the life of the church. And we also continue to support the ministries of all of our McCouncils as they support those leaders. Also that we're really continuing to empower and support congregations and leaders towards health and vitality so that we can be engaged in effective mission and ministry in the world. So I think I've gotten a lot of questions either directly or actually on social media, folks saying every time something happens in the world, well, where does the church stand on that? We have a lot of General Assembly policy that tells us exactly where the church stands on so many things. We are the Church of Jesus Christ, and we will continue to be the Church of Jesus Christ. And we will also attend to the context that we're in right now by being attentive to the things that we need to highlight, to identify communities that are asking us to stand with and for them, and to advocate with and for them in this particular time. And also to say, maybe we actually need to take a look at that policy again, because maybe that policy was sufficient for 30 years ago, but maybe that policy is not sufficient for now. And asking the assembly to reconsider some of those things. so that we can actually, as a body then, discern God's will and determine how we actually should move forward together as a covenant community. So we'll continue to respond according to our theological values and our faithfully discerned policies. And we'll continue to tweak and learn and be transformed as we go along the way. And part of that tweaking, and there are no more slides after this, so I can just talk about the unification, is unification of the former office of the General Assembly and the Presbyterian mission agencies. Part of, I think, the opportunity of that unification is an opportunity to bring together this artificial bifurcation of the ecclesial function of the church and the missional function of the church, as if those things didn't have anything to do with one another. And yet, I think our Constitution is really clear that who we are is what undergirds how we actually live that out in the world. That our biblical and theological foundation that then gives expression in our polity is actually then giving expression to the ways in which we live out our theological and biblical convictions, and also how we discern then what our faithful discipleship looks like in the world. And so it's an opportunity to bring those two together. Some of you know that, or maybe most of you know, that part of that has involved some programs that were cut in the fall, peacemaking program, the theology office, in order for us to actually reimagine what the support of peacemaking and theology might look like in this time. So we're still in conversation about that expression as we continue to move forward. It's not because we don't care about theology or peacemaking, but because we want to think about how to actually help it be infused throughout the agency as a whole. And then more recently, some of you, or most of you may be aware that we have closed the area of world mission, and then opened a new area called Global Ecumenical Partnerships. And what that means functionally then is that the mission co-workers who are actually doing the on-the-ground work with specific partners in different countries, those positions have been eliminated, and we have created positions of global ecumenical liaisons that will, in part, look a little bit more like the area and regional coordinators in the various spaces in the world. We'll have half of those global ecumenical liaisons that will function internationally, and half of them that will function domestically in order to support diaspora communities and other ecumenical partners within our midst. We still have a lot of work left to do in unification. The first step that the Unification Commission took was to name executive leadership in my position. I recently named in the beginning of March an interim senior leadership team that will continue to do that work alongside the Unification Commission, and a newly stood up Unification Management Office. We have a unification manager now in place who will basically be the manager of all the different projects that will be involved in unification, will help us to prioritize and then sequence those unification projects. And we'll work with staff doing those projects until we can reach completion of the unification program. And so a lot of the work is still yet to be done. And it feels like the Unification Commission got started almost three years ago, almost. And we have been talking about unification for a long time. But much of the work, or the bulk of the work, is still, in terms of structural unification, is still left to be done. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions from folks.
We need to use a microphone, so if anyone has a question, I'll bring you the mic.
regulations of the rules of discipline have not been updated in many cases in the form of government. So is there somebody under your authority who can search that out and fix all those references to D that are no longer relevant?
Yes.
Is somebody working on it now?
Yes. So I do know that they tried to do as much of that work as possible before the publishing of the last book of order that came out last year. But there are people who are continuing to work on making sure that it fits the church discipline section now.
Okay, thank you.
A little bit following the changes in world missions. Thank you. Carla Practice and Pastor Clerk, Presbyterian Church. I just wonder if you could share a little bit about, I mean, I know part of it, we're just trying to be more sustainable, that's a piece of it. But I asked one mission coworker, just for her sense of things, and she said there's so much that's sad, but also things that are exciting. And I just wonder if you could share your sense of what is hopeful about this transition, and if there are pieces of it that are exciting to you, to share what those are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for naming both of those. That there is so much of this that is sad, because I think, last week in a chapel service that was actually celebrating and honoring the work of those who have gone before, including those who are serving until last week. We named almost 200 years of Presbyterian mission and the various forms that it has taken. And I think part of that story, actually, we told it in 4 waves. And I think that was helpful, I think, for us to name, because we're sort of naming this sort of next wave of Presbyterian global engagement. And I think part of what feels really exciting is recognizing in a lot of our conversations with global ecumenical partners, the exciting things that they're doing that we can be learning from. And so we've had a couple of, so I've been a part of a few different conversations, including 2 denominations that came to Louisville to learn from the PCUSA. They came, the United Church of Christ in the Philippines came because they wanted to learn about our foundation and Board of Pensions functions, because they were thinking about how to care for their church workers more effectively. And they felt like we had a really great system. And they said, the Presbyterian Church USA, they are made up of 5 denominations that got brought together. And the PCUSA sort of founded denomination as part of that grouping. They said the PCUSA is really well known for structure and managing money well. And so if you can come to our assembly, it will help us actually pass, I think, this sort of new initiative that we're going to propose to our assembly. But as they were talking, and they were saying, no, we're here to learn from you, we're here to learn from you, as they were talking, they started talking about what they were doing in terms of Real Estate Development Corporation in their midst, and what they were doing in terms of Christian discipleship, what they were doing in terms of the work with youth and children. And we started saying, gosh, there's so much that we can learn from you in your work. What could we actually do together? What could we learn from you by sharing conversation in a more equal partnership as folks are, as you continue to think about the next chapter of your life as a denomination. And the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan came to visit as well. And again, they came to engage more partnership, to think about things that they could learn from various parts of our denomination and our agency and entity structure. And they started talking about the civil disobedience training that they were doing because of their situation in Taiwan and the need to do that. And we started engaging them about, like, what are you doing? What are some things that you're learning from that training now that maybe is new for this particular time of social media and how you actually do civil disobedience and nonviolent action in this time. Are there ways that we might partner more closely together over time? Are there folks, churches, councils that would be interested in doing more work sustainably over the years with this particular denomination and its partners that they're engaging? Are there people that you are identifying as leaders that need to be supported, who already know the language, who know the culture, who are going to be able to navigate some of those new contextual realities? So I think those are the conversations that are really exciting as possibilities. I think I was sharing at lunchtime also, 2 weeks ago I was with a 70-member delegation at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. It's the largest Presbyterian denomination that we've had at CSW, and we had an opportunity to engage the Cuba mission. And we have particular policies, very specific policies about the sort of things that we will do with and for the Cuban people and also the Presbyterian Reformed Church. And there's also an active mission partnership network. And so what are some of the things that we might do by bringing maybe newly interested congregations and councils and mission networks and partners that may be doing different sorts of work but being at the same table together to work towards some of those things that we've discerned together as policy that are also being asked of us by our partners in the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba. What are some ways in which we can advocate for justice and wholeness for them? So I think there's some real opportunities there as global ecumenical liaisons are able to help bridge those relationships, bring folks together, to help folks identify partners and work. And I think also the domestic side also is really exciting to think about. I was just sharing that the GA Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Dialogue Relations actually just finalized the wording on a covenant document with the Gemim denomination in Indonesia. And that's been years in the making. And the folks who are Gemim or Indonesian from a particular part of Indonesia, who all belong to Gemim, who are now in the US, part of PCUSA, they're wanting to be involved in the PCUSA, but also maintain that relationship with their denomination of origin. And so I think, again, building all of those relationships and seeing what possibilities emerge out of that, I think are some real exciting possibilities going into the future.
Jihan, we have a question from online.
Okay.
There's often a felt separation between the work of the denomination and churches on the ground. How can we empower congregations to feel their voices are heard? What can the assembly do?
Can you read that one more time?
Oftentimes there seems to be a separation between the work of the denomination and local congregations. How can we empower congregations to feel their voices are heard? And what can the assembly do?
So I wonder if the person who's asking the question might clarify a little bit. Is it the work of the denomination? Is it the work of the General Assembly? Is it both and?
The work of the denomination. Oftentimes local congregations say, well, they go to the denomination again, doing crazy stuff, and we don't have any idea what they do with that. So how can we be more connected, I guess, than
Yeah. So this question actually makes me think about a parish in Iowa that I visited some years ago. They came to St. Louis when I was running the face-to-face as the manager for call process support. They had been searching for a pastor for their parish for a while. They met that pastor, immigrant pastor who had been searching for a call for some time. And he said yes to going to the middle of Iowa from a larger urban setting to serve this congregation. And when I was visiting them on my sort of visit of 3 of the Iowa presbyteries, they said, we love our pastor. Never stop doing what you're doing so that we can find pastors and other churches can find pastors as well. And then in the very next breath, they actually said to me, we're never going to pay per capita again because the General Assembly voted to take our guns away. And I sort of looked at them and I said, we literally cannot come for your guns. Like the General Assembly of the PCUSA cannot come for your guns. But I also understand that you felt like it when the General Assembly voted for gun control and advocacy around gun safety and other things that are part of our policy. And I, said to them, you all could engage in writing an overture to the Assembly if it feels like the Assembly is always only dealing with things that you don't care about. You could do that. And they said, well, it feels like Presbytery would never actually pass it because the Presbytery is run by those big churches in the city. And so people wouldn't actually vote for our overture to go to the Assembly anyway. And I said, yeah, but you could always try. And you could always get a hearing. And you could always discern together and engage in conversation in your presbytery setting. Indeed, I have often wondered if congregations like yours are actually more focused on your own ministry and your own context and less likely to engage the meeting processes of the assembly, whether that's presbytery level or a synod level or an assembly level. And they said, yeah, that's probably about right. But we're still not going to ever pay per capita, and we're probably not going to send an overture. That feels a little bit like a quandary. I want to say to those congregations, you never know where you're going to get the support from, and so please work on an overture and send it to your presbytery and talk to your presbytery members and see what the General Assembly thinks about a particular thing that you care about. And if it feels like we need to talk more about evangelism, then please write an overture about evangelism. If it feels like we need to talk more about youth and young adults, please send an overture, right? Work on an overture about it. Consult with people who can help you write that overture to get that sort of communal discernment from the body. But I also think it's important, right, that sometimes some of those conversations will happen only at the mid-councils, and maybe those overtures don't get passed on. But I think if there was a way for us to continue to share that, what's happening and what's being heard at the assembly, or at the presbyteries or within the congregation, then we want to keep our ears open to that. And so folks are welcome to write emails. I might not be able to reply to them right away, but they can surely write.
Other questions in the room?
Hi, I'm Megan Hardy. I'm a first-year student here at Inquirer of Your Care, Presbytery of St. Andrew. I was curious, we were talking about, none of the task force is going to continue its work until GA, but in these conversations about priorities of ordination changing, what do you see as, what are you imagining as we are sort of looking towards the world, towards the future of ordinations in the PCUSA?
Yeah. So I'm going to give a very state-of-Clerk process answer. In that, really, that I think, I resourced that task force before I moved into this current position, and I really just tried to be the process person to help them think through who they needed to be speaking with as they were doing their discernment, because it really is the work of that task force as they listen. I know that they're doing a lot of focus grouping right now to talk to a variety of people and variety of communities about what some of the pain points are, what their needs are and for spiritual leadership within the congregations, and new worshiping communities, right, and other ways of organizing at this point. I do wonder about I do continue to wonder about how we actually think about ordination versus spiritual leadership and how we untangle those, that those are not always one and the same. And also recognize the reality that to serve in particular places like chaplaincy even, you do need to be ordained, right? And so there is part of that, the reality. And also there are ways to be spiritual leaders without actually being ordained. And how do we help people feel equipped and authorized to do that work without always feeling like they have to have the thing in the whole process in order to do that? And how do we not then shut people's voices out because they don't have that ordination, right? Yeah, sorry, I know that's not a really clear answer.
Thank you for being here at Region Country Seminary. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, it's building on Megan's question in a way, what role would you love to see seminaries play, especially those affiliated with Presbyterian Church USA, in the formation and support of spiritual leaders as you envision the church in the future?
Thank you. So this is me just putting an idea out there that hasn't really been vetted, so I'm just going to say that. One of the things that's been emerging in some recent conversations with, APCU and some folks in Campus Conference Center Ministry and some other seminaries is, wondering about how we might all partner together to say that from the time that one is baptized to the time that one completes one's baptism, what does it look like to have a discernment and vocational trajectory at which we all sort of play a different part? And how could each of those associated or organizations, institutions play a part in that? And how are those organizations and institutions uniquely gifted and called to be able to contribute to that particular pathway for all people within the PCUSA? One of the conversations that happened recently was with Columbia Seminary, where some mid-council leaders said, we really need to think about pipeline building for mid-council leadership. And so what does that look like? What does discernment for that look like? What does equipping for that look like? How can seminaries participate in that? But as we were having conversations, we said, well, that's also true for agency and entity leadership within the denomination. It's probably true for seminary and Campus Conference Center leadership. It's probably true for, sort of college ministries. It's probably true for all these sorts of parts of the ecosystem that actually contribute to the health and wellness of the body and its witness and the equipping for ministry. And so I think, Columbia got sort of pulled into that conversation with some council leaders about that particular trajectory. But are there other seminaries that feel really called to another part of that that sort of arc? What could that look like for us to say, we're going to work on this section here or this arc, and we're all going to try to do that so that we have this continuum when we work together. That's been something that's sort of been emerging, I think, in some conversations, and again, just totally unvetted, but would be really excited about a possible conversation about that.
One final question. We want to invite everyone to a little reception in the Rose reception area. We'll have a closing prayer, and we'd like to have time with you. Madam Clerk, enjoy the fellowship. Gracious God, thank you for this day and for this sharing time. Thank you for Jihan's leadership